Okay, I did forget last time, unfortunately. So that's why there was no lecture for those of you who might have been looking for it on YouTube. I forgot. But I'm curious to hear some other impressions in terms of your experience reading Kant. Maybe from those who have read Kant before, and there could be a handful of you, and also from those who have never been familiar with his writing or his ideas. What are just some impressions of your experience trying to work through these ideas? Anybody? Well,
I mean, it's been stated before, but I find his writing style kind of hilarious in like a brutally boring sort of way. Um, so I mean, I don't want to linger on that, but I think it's, despite the fact that it's boring, I want to point out just how methodical it is in a weird way in getting really weird, simple points across that are really heavy in just like this wall of text. And I think of the example in the beginning of our reading where he's saying like, if you asked me about a palace and asked me if I thought it was beautiful, I mean, he could just say I don't, but he says I don't in three different ways, and it just gives you a real sense of like his thought process, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example that we can spend some time on in a little bit. Just to qualify what you presented there in terms of the reading, however, he's making a really subtle point there, and that's moving in the direction of distinguishing conceptually and therefore formally the human experience of what he calls pleasant and the human experience of what he calls beautiful. So if you object to the claim that a palace, and so one example of that I use in the lecture slides, if you've looked at them already, is the Taj Mahal. So if you look at a palace like the Taj Mahal and someone asks you, oh, do you find that beautiful? And you say, no, I don't find it beautiful because I don't like palaces. I think that they're extravagant, too ostentatious, pretentious, and a waste of resources and so forth. And that's kind of an example he gives of what a possible response could be, a perfectly plausible one, right? Yet, what does he say about that? And so this is just to kind of, I'm going to do the role in a second, but I'm glad you mentioned that example because it can put us in a place to start thinking with Kant. So what does he say about that?
Oh.
Yeah, Joshua?
I was kind of just as something else that for me, like I took 3 hours to do that 13-page reading, and it pretty much took the whole 3 hours. I reread every paragraph at least twice, and sometimes 3 or 4 times. And once I kind of like broke through the barrier of like the text, it was like kind of psychedelic reading. Once I kind of broke through the barrier of my mind, like not wanting to engage with it, and then me like really trying to engage with it and hitting walls. But once I broke the barrier, like everything's like, oh, this is awesome. This is great. But I've been doing the reading and it's been like, it's been like 30, 40 minutes. Like, wow, I just want to read the summary. Kind of just like look at Spark Notes real quick. Because this is kind of like hurting my eyes. And then it was weird. I felt myself get like drowsy and all tired when I was doing the reading. Like I was taking so much, I could feel like the calories burning in my brain. Then my head started overheating. And then like once I got to a point past that, it's like I was reading it, it was like it was semi-psychedelic of like the words and imprinting with me like a visceral, visual, literary experience. So I think that's why the cover is this, because once you like break through that, you experience that.
You get to the rainbow. Yeah.
You get the rainbow. I'm like, I'm an artistic genius. I knew it. Yes.
Good, good. So I'm glad you had some kind of psychedelic experience in engaging with Kant. That's really cool.
Weird.
But yeah, so back though to the palace example. So what does he say about that in terms of the attitude I presented? So someone objecting to the so-called beauty of the palace on these grounds that one disapproves of ostentation and pretentiousness and so forth. Does anyone remember what he says about that?
From my understanding, it's basically that beauty is independent of our like cognitive perception of something, and that we don't have, it doesn't have to be a good thing, and it doesn't have to be what is it, something that's agreeable to be beautiful, and that like it can be independent of what we think its like moral ground is, that we are simply appreciating the form that something has, that's what makes it beautiful, not its intention necessarily.
Precisely, yeah, because all of those thoughts, that basic attitude I just described, objecting to the palace for certain reasons, only makes sense if you understand the palace to actually exist. That is to say that the palace is a real physical thing that had to have been created by the effort of existing historical individuals, expending energy, expending money, and so forth. But Kant would say, well, that's great. You can object to the palace on all those grounds for all those reasons, but you're not actually addressing in those descriptions, in the expression of your position here, anything about beauty. Nothing to do with beauty. You can hold all those things as true, the reasons you don't favor the palace, but still think that the form, independently of whether it exists, so it could just be a hologram, right? And there we're talking about the form because of the way it deploys the powers of your imagination, your consciousness, into a kind of free engagement with each other, solicits a peculiar pleasure, right? So good. So that's just to kind of orient us to Kant's way of thinking. But now I'm going to just do the roll real quick. So I gave some people a chance to join us a little bit late, but have to make sure I get this attendance down. Okay, Jack. Is Jack here? Okay, Sadie. Is Thea here? I think I saw her.
Here.
Okay. Nehemiah is here. Joseph. Destery is here. Bennett.
Yeah, I'm here.
Donnie is here. Wyatt. Okay, Justin. Is Justin Gray here? All right. Tristan.
Here.
Sam. Joshua's here. Raven. Eva.
Here.
Jackie. Here. Brianna's here. Michaela.
Here.
Mac is here. B. B. Nelson. Tyler. Kai is here. Kala. James. Micah. Megan.
I'm here.
And Ryan. Ryan Wingrove. Okay. All right. And just to take a glance at the group presentation assignments, in case there is any confusion or questions about that. Our presenters for this week, so for Thursday, are Destery, Wyatt, Raven, and James. Okay. And so let me know if you have any questions about the presentation. All right, so, oh, Raven is here. Let me fix the roll real quick. Okay. So there are a couple things to wrap up with respect to Aristotle and the mimetic theory of art. So I want to talk about Aristotle's conception of beauty. And so perhaps if some of you have in mind a passage from the text where he addresses the nature of beauty, you might bring that up. So I want that to be clarified before we move on to Kant. And I also want to ensure that we all have a pretty solid understanding of what exactly the artist is supposed to be imitating. So what is the nature of mimesis? And towards that end, so what is the nature of mimesis in consideration of Aristotle's aesthetic theory? Towards that end, we can try to make an account of how Aristotle's influenced in this theoretical approach by Plato, right? So we can start there, I think. How is Aristotle's theory of mimesis, that is this notion that art is a kind of imitation, how is that influenced by Plato? So based on what we talked about from Plato, the excerpts from the Plato readings last week, where can you perceive or locate mimesis or imitation within Plato's theory, and I don't, or if you can call it a theory, within his theorizing or within his thinking, even independently of what we could call an aesthetic theory. So just in Platonism, broadly, where do you think mimesis or imitation shows up? So I'm thinking, just to give you a hint, of the theory of the forms. So where can we find imitation in Plato, in his metaphysics, let's say?
I just feel like when we did the reading where he's talking about like imitation in poetry, that reading, is that what you're talking about? Where it was in context of like
Yeah, you
plays and
can go
poetry?
reading, but just also in terms of our conversation about Plato's metaphysics more broadly. So the theory of the forms, which does show up, of course, in the Symposium, and to a lesser, that is, less obvious sense in the Ion. But it certainly appears in the Sophist and the Laws.
Is it kind of like truth with a capital T? I forget who brought that up last time, but the sense of like everything is an imitation because there is no comparable or like there's no like definition of these like specific things that we are imitating that we can say this is the final form of it, and therefore everything is an interpretation of these abstract truths. We agree on?
Good. So, for example, I'll just pull this up because it might be helpful, this image real quick. And this is an example of conceptual art from the 20th century. So I'm looking for Joseph Kossuth's 1 and 3 chairs. Let me find a good image of that. This one's pretty good. Oops. Ugh, what the hell? Here we go. Okay, so let me share the screen and show you. So this is work of conceptual art. I think it was produced in the 1960s by Joseph Kossuth. Let me share the screen. So this is an effort on the part of a conceptual artist to render Plato's theory of the forms intelligible through a sensuous medium, that is to say, an experienceable medium. So you have 1 and 3 chairs. So there is a problem of unity and multiplicity. So on the one hand, you have to the left, you have an obvious representation of a chair, given that it's a 2-dimensional image that one could never sit in or use as a chair would be used. But as a 2-dimensional image, in other words, an imitation, it is a representation of this physical chair, which one could sit in, right? And so think of Plato's allegory of the cave. So this photograph of a chair would be comparable to the shadows at the bottom of the cave, which are an imperfect encapsulation, imitation, or representation of, say, a puppet or a statue, a little model, however, a 3-dimensional model of a chair that one might bring along the raised walkway that is reflected negatively to give you the shadowy image. But then that chair, so this middle object, is in fact, in a similar way to how the photograph is related to it, it is in fact an imitation or a representation of the abstract idea of chairness more broadly, such that one has to know what a chair is, of what a chair in its production is possible, before creating an example of a chair. And so we have a logos, that is to say, a definition of a chair. And even though, like Theo was saying, this abstract idea of chairness is too broad for us to ever compass in any kind of experience, such that we could reduce any possibility of chairness to this or that form. In any case, it's an orientation to what's possible. So the concept or logos of chairness, you could say, at the same time encompasses every possible chair of which anyone could ever conceive, including those examples that one has never yet thought of or experienced, but such that it doesn't privilege any one of these as paradigmatic, let's say, of chairness. So there is a series or a pattern of mimesis or imitation that accounts for the relationship between the sensuous particulars that make up the objects with which we're familiar in this world and the universal ideas or forms which get instantiated in this or that material assemblage that we can observe and make use of, and so forth. And so that's where imitation or mimesis shows up in Plato. And there are different words employed that get translated in different ways in the English language renderings of these dialogues. And so what is the relationship exactly between, say, the capital F form of chairness and this or that particular chair that we can sit in or think about? Well, they relate to each other by representation, as we've been saying. So the physical chair represents the idea of chairness. It imitates the idea of chairness, but always falling short of a perfect imitation because there's always more to build on or call attention to. So representation, imitation, manifestation. So this chair here is a physical material manifestation of the universal idea of chairness. So representation, imitation, manifestation, but also we sometimes find the language of participation. So when the artist produces the chair, or when the photographer produces this image of the physical chair, they're not just representing something or imitating something in a static sense. They are also participating in the being of the idea. And that's really important. And that is something to hold on to and to keep in mind as we examine these various critical responses to mimetic theory on the part of Kant and Hegel, because we'll see how Kant argues against it for certain reasons, which will be followed, albeit differently, by a different sort of argument when we get to Hegel. But I'd like to just leave open the possibility that they're missing something in terms of what mimesis lays out for us. So in other words, just to cut this short, this discussion of Plato, it's not simply that this photograph is in a static way as a copy of the chair. It's not simply that the photograph is a static mere copy, a mere imitation, a mere representation, but the relationship of original to copy is one of participation, such that the so-called copy is actually, in a deeper way, actively participating in the very being of the original. That is to say, expanding or augmenting the being of the original. So when a landscape painter, for example, imitates a beautiful scene, they're not just slavishly reproducing what's already there necessarily. They're not just copying some original, but the act of imitation is at once an act of participation in which they are perhaps bringing attention to some aspects of the beautiful landscape in the representation that otherwise would not have been noticed, right? So that is to say, an artistic rendering of a landscape or a portrait of an individual's personage contributes actively in a participatory way to expanding and deepening the nature of the original, right? Does that make sense? And so the word for participation, the word in the Greek that gets translated in English to participation is methexis. So mimesis seems to be always accompanied by methexis, this kind of participation in the very being that gets instantiated or manifested. And so Walter Benjamin, that was the optional reading that I made available for last week, he talks about this in terms of creating or engaging in the observation and recognition of non-sensuous similarities between things. So in another work, Benjamin talks about a child playing, so you might have memories of this, like a child playing with a butterfly. So imagine you're a child, you see a butterfly, and you start following the butterfly around. And you start in a peculiar way, given your own bodily form and how it's profoundly different from that of the insect, you start imitating the butterfly. So maybe you see it fluttering about and you move your arms about wildly to imitate the wings. Well, that's how children learn. So that's what Aristotle has in mind in terms of human beings being essentially mimetic creatures. So the child is imitating the butterfly, but in that imitation, the child is somehow participating in the very life of the butterfly, acting like a butterfly. And in the relationship in that moment between the child and the butterfly too is somehow rendered childlike. The child starts to see herself or himself in the form of the butterfly. And there is a relationship of similarity between the two entities, between child and butterfly, that is not immediately apparent because of such undeniable differences between them. And so Aristotle makes this interesting remark about the nature of metaphor too, which is really important. If I can find it pretty quickly. If anyone remembers where this comes up, but this is on page 119. And so this is the section in Aristotle on diction, right? Diction is one of those essential 6 criteria or categories for the poetic structure of mimesis. But on page 119, he makes the point that in terms of diction, metaphor is the most important variety. as he says, "It is a great thing indeed to make a proper use of these poetical forms, as also of compounds of strange words. But the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. It is the one thing that cannot be learnt from others, and it is also a sign of genius, since a good metaphor implies an intuitive perception of the similarity in dissimilars." Right? So metaphor is a kind of poetic evidence or instantiation of an individual's ability to recognize strong and important aesthetic similarities between entities that or phenomena that are in other respects entirely dissimilar. And in the Benjamin piece, he talks about this as a primitive modality of human thought and experience, as really the origin of things like astrology, right? So it's because of this mimetic faculty that ancient human beings were able to perceive a similarity between um, uh, between these astral forms, relationships between stars and constellations and so forth, patterns of sensuous appearance, to see similarities there between character types or features of an individual's personality, right? So we take that now, of course, or at least many of us do, who don't exactly embrace astrology. We take that as some kind of fictitious, illusory, fanciful nonsense, however fun it might be. I'm not criticizing anybody who likes astrology, but I think Benjamin gives a plausible account for why that line of reasoning even emerged in the first place. So this is just to say, when we talk about mimesis from even the point of view of Aristotle, we don't necessarily mean imitation as the straightforward and reductive relationship between an original and a copy, or a model and a representation. Because when you bring these elements together, there's also a strong degree of participation, which isn't just copying and reproducing, but it is, in an important sense, an exploration and an enlivening, an expansion of the original. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Are there any questions about that? And so the last thing I want to call attention to in Aristotle is just the question of beauty, because this is really at the heart of Kant's aesthetic thematic here, at least in particular for today's reading. Discriminating between, in a formal way, the experience of beauty versus goodness, or that which is agreeable. But did anyone pick up on a kind of account or definition of beauty, how to make sense of beauty in Aristotle? Did anyone notice where that showed up?
I'll chime in. My notes are kind of mixed together.
Sure.
So I kind of confused some of them, but I remember Aristotle talking about form exceeding our sensory perception of beauty. So I kind of remember talking about form, but
well, I think you might have in mind Plato still, from
is that?
Yeah, Diotima's account.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so beauty was a huge part of the Plato discussion, as it is, of course, given this week's theme of the Kant discussion, but it was a little more subtle, the ways in which Aristotle was playing with the concept of beauty. But if you have the text in front of you, there are a couple places. First of all, on page 96, and this is an excerpt from Aristotle's Metaphysics, and it was not assigned reading, but it's really short. So on page 96, there's this section called Beauty, and that's from book 13 of the Metaphysics. But I'll just look down to the kind of the middle of that paragraph, he says the chief forms of beauty are order and symmetry and definiteness, which the mathematical sciences demonstrate in a special degree. And since these are obviously causes of many things, evidently these sciences must treat this sort of causative principle also, that is the beautiful, as in some sense a cause. So that's really cool, first of all, because at the beginning of this class, when we're having a kind of free and general discussion of aesthetics and art, many of you made the point that there is a kind of mathematical dimension or component to the notion of beauty in terms of, say, symmetry, for example, or proportion. And this connects to limit, right? So we were talking about the Greek positive interpretation or account of the nature of limit, which is perhaps surprising given that it seems to be negative. But one way to deepen that understanding is to call attention to how freedom is related to limit, which is paradoxical, it seems, right? So Aristotle and other Greeks, such as Plato before him, would make the argument that freedom is dependent upon limit because, and this is kind of the point I was making last time, you can't even recognize a form as the form that it is in distinction from that which it is not, by which it's surrounded, unless it is limited. And so observing the limit, the hard contours between phenomena, allows that phenomenon in itself in a kind of freedom to free up and show itself or self-present as what it is. So freedom is involved. And so here, proportion, limit, symmetry, freedom, these are all deeply intimate concepts, intimately related with a strong affinity. But this is from, this is the last thing we'll say about Aristotle. And this is just to sort of soften the enormous historical leap from ancient Hellenic thought to 18th century Germany on this question of beauty. So remember, and this might have struck you as so banal, just so commonplace that it's not even worth mentioning, right? But on page 105, when Aristotle says, every plot, and remember, plot is the most important element in the construction of any poetic work. Plot is the most important because it's that which, the plot, which is imitating action, praxis. But every plot has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you might think, well, no fucking shit. Everything that exists temporally has to have, so this could be an activity, this could be an event, a broadly far-reaching historical timeline, and we could put a work of art like a tragedy, for example, in this context. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. But notice what he's doing with this structure. It's not just, even though this is sort of how he's defining it, what is a beginning? Well, beginning is that which is not necessarily after anything else and which naturally has something else after it, right? A middle, that which is by nature after one thing and has also another after it. End, that which is after something else, either as its necessary usual consequent and with nothing else after it. Okay, well, obviously, right? But it's not simply in a relational sense, temporal relational sense, what is to be demarcated as the beginning versus the middle and the end, because when it comes to a tragedy or a comic play, for example, even if you were to take, and we've had experiences, of course, of cinema that plays with the typical linearity of activities. So often films will mix that sort of thing up, in more experimental theater as well. So you can have what was in time, in terms of the history, what was the end of an experience or an event presented first, and then you might work backwards. So that's possible. But what Aristotle is talking about here is there has to be a particular direction to an event such that there is a sort of activity that's appropriate for each category, right? For the success of a particular poetic work of art. And so here's what I want to comment on when it comes to making sense of beauty from the Aristotelian mimetic point of view. So this structure tells us something important about beauty. And so this is on, what page is that? Don't have it written here. Just want to make sure you know where to find this in the text. It's on page 105. So he says, a well-constructed plot, therefore, cannot begin at any point one likes. Beginning and end in it must be of the forms just described. Again, to be beautiful, a living creature, and every whole made up of parts, must not only present a certain order in its arrangement of parts, but also be in a certain definite magnitude. So we're talking about symmetry and proportion. Beauty is a matter of size and order, and therefore impossible either one, in a very minute, so incredibly small creature, since our perception becomes indistinct as it approaches instantaneity, or two, in a creature of vast size, one say 1,000 miles long. As in that case, instead of the object being seen all at once, the unity and wholeness of it is lost to the beholder, right? So this tells us some really interesting and important things about the nature of beauty. So as I'm teasing out of this account, there are two important criteria. So one involving a subjective source and the other what we might call objective. So the subjective source has to do with one's capacity as a subject to perceive, or on the basis of a sensuous perception, experience the quality of beauty that's supposed to be inherent in a thing. So if you're dealing with a really tiny insect, for example, or like a single cell organism, or something that's not even visible, we can't call it beautiful. Or if something is visible, like let's say a grain of sand, you wouldn't call it beautiful because the perception becomes indistinct. There are no qualities to it that you can tease out or pinpoint as evidence of what we usually ascribe to things of a beautiful nature, right? It's simply there. And so your visual apprehension of the grain of sand becomes instantaneous with the very thing in itself. And so there's no room, basically, to note any beauty. And then on the other hand, there seems to be something objective in terms of how a thing, independently of any experience of it, is organized or arranged proportionally or symmetrically in terms of its parts. So that then, in terms of beauty, has to do with a quality of design. But then to go very briefly back to the first criterion, the one that's subjective. So he mentions 1,000, an object or an entity that's like 1,000 miles long. We wouldn't be able to call that beautiful because you only see a fragmentary part of it at any particular moment. And the suggestion then seems to be that the experience of beauty requires an experience of a whole. So you can't say that this object is beautiful because you haven't been able to sensuously apprehend it in its totality, right? You've only seen a little part of it. And so this tells us that beauty has to do with a complete being. As he talked about tragedy, for example, imitating a complete action, which has then, as any complete action would, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, so does this make sense? This idea of beauty, are there any questions about it? And so we'll be able to see how Kant is responding to this and questioning it, but also in some ways presupposing and building on this theoretical starting point that he took over from the history of aesthetic discourse. But are there any questions about this? Does it make sense?
Oh, sorry, you can go.
Oh yeah, Kai.
Yeah, you can go first.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask if you could speak more about the nature of the beautiful objects necessary aspect of design alongside human apprehension being a thing required.
Yeah, so the first problem, the subjective aspect, has to do with one's ability as a subject to recognize or perceive forms. But then the other criterion has to do with the forms themselves in terms of how they're designed. And I don't mean in this instance the Platonic sense of forms, but really any kind of material sensuous construction, which is a composite. That is to say, it's not simply made up of parts. And so that has to do with the necessary relationship and role of a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is organized by principles of design before any consumer or perceiver would even come upon the thing in the first place. Does that make sense? And so to connect this to poetry, though, remember what's one difference between tragedy and an epic? Can anyone think of an example of a difference that's relevant for this discussion? So compare, say, Shakespeare's Hamlet, right, which takes place over a relatively small, circumscribable number of days, right? It lays out just a few events, a few experiences. And then think of Homer's Odyssey, right, which transposes over years and years.
Is it the characters themselves and their natures?
Well, it's how the narration is presented in one sense, but here I'm talking about just the size, right?
Oh, well, yeah, they're like different in the structure of their narrative.
So if someone were to create a kind of theatrical production of Homer's Odyssey, and they wanted to give a place for every instance, it would be a horrific failure, right? It would be much too long, cumbersome, unwieldy. It wouldn't work, right? And so that then is the objective nature of the design of the composition. So the magnitude of each event, the symmetry of the different actions and events vis-a-vis each other, and so forth. And there's a problem of one's subjective attunement to it too, because as a historical unfolding, it's just much too large for you to apprehend in any satisfying way, for you to consume or to take in any satisfying way. So just looking at these examples of poetry, we can see how those two qualities work out in terms of the nature of beauty. But does that help? Does that make sense?
So it's got to do with what we attribute to the different kinds of works of art that are beautiful. So like it would be weird to call Hamlet an epic, but it's still beautiful in a different way. It's just the design is different.
Exactly. And so the design, and this is the principle that we pulled out of Aristotle before, form follows function. So then the form of your experience, if you're an audience member or a reader of these productions, will be different as a response to what's given in the design of the original, which you're observing or taking in, right? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, thanks.
Question about that?
I thought kind of what I got from what you were saying about the difference between the epic and the tragedies, I thought that he wrote something about like breaking it up into episodes. Doesn't he say something about that to that extent as far as the magnitude and being able to fit a much bigger story into a smaller thing by breaking it up into those episodes so that, I mean, like for instance, in the case of the Odyssey, we're not talking about slashing through sinews, 1,000 times because it's in there like 1,000,000 times. They break it down into easily digestible parts. Wasn't that part of what he was saying?
Yeah, so that's why you're talking about the episode versus, I can't remember the word used for the counterpoint there, but episodes are really important for epics as opposed to tragedies, because in terms of the narrative of the Odyssey, he says, look, it's basically a story about a guy's difficulty going home. That's what the Odyssey is. But there are all kinds of episodes which are not as episodic. They're not necessary for the unfolding of that overarching plot, right? So, that's the distinction between episode and plot, right? Yet the episodes tell you something about the characters and are thus a source of pleasure. And so for that reason, even though the epic is very long and might become boring if you compare it to a tragedy, there are little instances to keep you going or to motivate your continued interest in the piece, right? But if you put too many episodes in, say, a tragedy, given that the timeline is much shorter and more neatly coherent, then you might just be confusing the reader or the audience, or introducing a bunch of inessential complexities. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so I don't want to take much more time with Aristotle, given the difficulty of Kant, but are there any final questions about this? And we can, where it's appropriate, come back to Aristotle to make these connections. And we'll certainly do so, especially given Kant's critical reaction to mimesis, right? So he's parting ways with mimesis here. But yeah, Kai, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask about, like the whole view in beauty. Like just, I don't know. It's just it was just kind of a personal opinion and stuff like that. Just how beauty tends to be like in the eye of the beholder. Like what qualifies one person as being more worthy to judge it over another.
Yeah, so I think whether you were talking about Aristotle or Kant, we're going to get two different responses to that kind of question. With Aristotle, as we've already said, there would be those two elements at play. So in terms of the subject, is the phenomenon in question that you are attempting to demarcate into beauty or ugliness, is it too small with respect to your perception, or is it too big? But then there's the objective side. And so also that subjective side, it's not just owing to the relation to the size of the phenomenon, it could have to do with distance too. So for example, if you're too far away in a gallery from a painting on the wall, you won't be able yet to say whether or not it's beautiful. But then as you get closer, that subjective criterion is fulfilled, because now you're close enough that you can see the painting as a whole, but you're not so close that you're like staring at this or that little quality, right? So the subjective side is fulfilled, but now you have to actually take a look at the design. So here's where Aristotle's talking about proportion and symmetry. And so think about how we often, as a matter of giving a psychological explanation, how we often use this language and this approach to make sense of differences in perception of beauty, but also similarities. So for example, some actors are said to be more handsome or beautiful than others owing to symmetry, facial symmetry, right? So I've heard that Denzel Washington has the most symmetrical face in Hollywood. And so that's supposed to be some explanatory account of why it is that many people find him handsome. And so that goes all the way back to these Platonic and Aristotelian conceptions of beauty as having to do objectively, so on that side of things, with proportion and symmetry, which is a relationship between parts and the constitution of a whole, right? So then if one has too big of a nose, it would overwhelm the totality of the appearance of the face, and thus would result in an ugly appearance by some accounts, right? So does that make sense? So here we're really talking about symmetry and proportion as principles or orientations of a kind of design intent or focus. Okay. But to get us to Kant now, though, you said beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and what gives someone the authority or more authority over others to ascribe or recognize qualities that we could characterize the beauty of things.
Yeah, one could probably say status, but I don't think that's a valid indication at all.
No, so that's similar. So status or respectability, that's something close to the sort of account that you would find in David Hume, of which Kant is actually critical. So that's part of what motivates his approach. So if you ask Hume, well, what is it, how should we decide? Let me say it this way. How should we decide when a work of art is beautiful or not? Well, you have to turn to those with taste, right? So you look to those who have taste. So something is beautiful if a person with taste says it's beautiful. And then you can ask, okay, well, how do I decide who has taste? Well, it's someone who's well equipped to recognize beautiful things. And then you're kind of moving in a circle, right? And in the end, Hume is forced to conclude by way of this idea of custom. So what is termed as beautiful is simply what a given culture or society has traditionally esteemed to be beautiful, right? But that doesn't really tell us anything in terms of philosophy about the nature of beauty as a form. So that's just based on our experience, and we end up moving in a circle. So Kant, and this is what's very strange, subtle, but hugely profound, I would suggest, about Kant's approach to these questions. He would say, on the one hand, you are absolutely right that beauty is subjective, right? So that's part of the definition, but it's not subjective in the way that we would assume that kind of category to mean. So it's weird. The category of beauty versus the category of goodness or the category of the agreeable or agreeableness is formally distinct in that it is subjective, but it's only subjective because it takes place within the ground of the subject's experience of pleasure and pain. So when I call a sunset beautiful, it's because in some way I've experienced pleasure from that observation. But when I call it beautiful, it's not just subjective in the sense that, say, I like escargot or something and you don't, or I enjoy strong coffee and you enjoy weak tea or something like that is subjective, in which case it would be insane for me to browbeat you into agreeing that coffee is better than tea if you simply don't like it, right? There's no argument there. There's nothing I can tell you that will make you appreciate coffee if you don't appreciate coffee. But if we do the same thing when it comes to something I call beautiful, not just enjoyable or pleasant or agreeable, like a sunset, and if you say, well, I don't know, I don't think it's all that beautiful, I'm not just gonna let it go. You're like, well, what the fuck? Like, you have to think it's beautiful. Like, what's the matter with you? Right? So there's some objective aspect to it, but he's still recognizing that the experience of the beautiful, the recognition of it as a phenomenon takes place only on the basis of one's experience of pleasure or pain. But when I say it's beautiful, I'm at the same time arguing, even if implicitly, that everyone else ought to also perceive it as beautiful, even if everyone else might not, right? Because here we're dealing with the category of ought, which is a normative category, rather than the category of is, which is purely descriptive. So Owen, you have your little yellow hand up. Yeah.
Oh yes, I just was thinking that we can explore this idea of bridging the subjective with more objective qualifiers of beauty through taste by thinking of music, and specifically of musicians as arbiters of musical authority in some respect. They don't define what is like 100% tasteful music, of course, but because they have in some sense been required to put in the time to learn the technical aspects of music, they're not only more knowledgeable about what makes music sound good to them, but they also are in some way like seen just socially as having something about them that you might like look to when you're thinking about beauty in music. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. Like for some people, rich people are more likely to have better taste, right? Like we touched on that. And that's because they had access to education about what we're reading right now.
Mhm. Yeah, good. So you're calling attention to musicians as producers, or at least potential producers of beautiful forms, beautiful musical forms. And then we can also put into this context the role of the listener or of the consumer of these forms. And this puts us in a position to bring together the roles in aesthetic life, production and consumption, of genius on the one hand and taste on the other. So to produce beautiful forms, according to Kant's theory, requires genius. And we might connect his understanding of genius to what we found in Aristotle earlier today when talking about metaphor, right? But to recognize the work of genius as a legitimate source of beauty requires taste, right? So taste is what exemplifies the critic or the consumer of art, and genius is what exemplifies the producer or creator of the beautiful forms that we encounter in a work of art. And as a genius, an artistic genius, one is in some sense participating in many ways, the excessive or overwhelming powers of nature. And so the genius then gives, as if following nature, the rule of art on the basis of which different artistic movements or traditions develop. So because, for example, some particular artist was understood to be a genius, something like expressionism or impressionism, or in the case of someone like Picasso, cubism gets developed. And so the genius is the one who is able, through interpreting nature, the productive powers of nature, to create new forms, and thus is not simply imitating, as Aristotle thought, but is actively, spontaneously creating new forms, which then give the rule for other artists to follow. And so, yeah, we'll dig into that more deeply, but yeah, I appreciate your comment there, Owen. Okay, so why don't we take just a quick break, just like 5 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and jump into some slides on Kant. And I don't know if you've looked at the reading guide already, but I have some images and so forth to make it a little easier for us to wrap our heads around together. Okay, so it's 2:33. So let's meet back here at, let's say, 2:38 or so. So 5 minutes or so, and I'll see you guys in a few minutes. The recording. I see there's interesting conversation going on in the chat. That's cool. All right. So I'm going to bring up the Kant reading, and much of today will be occupied, or will occupy ourselves working through this arguably tortured philosophical vocabulary that Kant is operating within. It's very dense and difficult. So let me share the screen. All right. So is everyone seeing Kant here? Making sure this is working. All right. Let me know if there are any issues, or again, feel free to interrupt if you have questions or want to make a comment. So this is just by way of some biographical details, a little summary of who Kant was as an important historical figure. But so there's all sorts of weird, in many cases, apocryphal accounts of Kant. So supposedly, despite being this profound intellectual giant, this great mind of the Enlightenment, he didn't really travel more than a few miles outside of his town, Königsberg, Prussia, which is now a part of Russia. But he's a German thinker, of course. And according to legend, he was actually so predictable and so regular in his daily habits that the citizens of Königsberg could set their clocks by his daily walks. And supposedly he died a virgin, and he was so taken by these ascetic tendencies, ascetic as in denying one's physical senses, denying pleasures and so forth, being a deeply committed and pious Christian, that supposedly he would confine himself at night to a kind of straitjacket. He would like wrap himself up so he wouldn't be able to masturbate. And then in the morning, he would have his poor assistant come like get him out of the bed and help him out of bed. And I actually have in mind, just as a fun project, to write like a novel based on the relationship between Kant and his assistant. Because like later in Kant's life, there's this journal entry. I think the assistant's name was, God, I can't remember his name right now. I'll have to look it up later. But he wrote in this journal entry, I must remember to forget the guy's name. Because at some point in his life, his assistant, because of Kant's treatment and the demands placed on him and placed on him in his role as assistant, he had a nervous breakdown and turned to like alcoholism and so forth. And so Kant felt a tinge of guilt later in his life, but such that he wanted to avoid thinking about his assistant because of the guilt that came up. But those are just some details of Kant's character, or his this kind of mythology surrounding his historical persona.
Just a question on that, if you could entertain me. How did a guy like that become, influential in the first place, especially back then, being as that he lived such a very eccentric, I don't even know what. I mean, if I met a guy like that today and said, I've got some things I should talk to you about, I'd like, I don't want to hear what you have to think. Like it's just really out there. Did he write like a book that somehow people bought? I mean, because it just...
Yeah, Kant was, he's of undeniable importance, and not just for these abstruse kind of philosophical questions that we're wrangling over, but in terms of the history of science too. So he's on any major respectable shortlist of the greatest minds in our intellectual history. And the first critique, and really, so we're reading what's known as the third critique here, the critique of judgment. The first critique was absolutely groundbreaking and constituted what Kant himself referred to, and many agreed, as the Copernican revolution in philosophy. That is to say, a revolution or a transformation in philosophical discourse and its essential presuppositions that would be analogous to or comparable to what Copernicus did in terms of reorienting ourselves to the nature of the universe. So Kant is hugely important, and he still continues to be important in his influence and legacy, again, not just in metaphysics or even aesthetics, but also in the natural sciences, according to so-called anti-realist views or instrumentalist views of science, or even the more recent theory of so-called model-based realism articulated by the late Stephen Hawking. That has even though Hawking was a kind of philosophical moron who, like many scientists, said really stupid shit about philosophy, In Hawking's own case, he didn't understand, even though he was disparaging philosophy, that he was actually doing philosophy when he said that science doesn't put us into direct contact with the nature of reality, but a kind of model of that reality. That is to say, an overarching representation of the reality which conforms to our structures of cognition. Well, that's taken straight from Kant, right? But these are arguments and theories that are still very much relevant today. So that's just a kind of short answer on, why we still talk about Kant. Does that make sense?
No, because I know why we still talk about Kant, because the ideas that he's expressed are like they make sense. What I'm just really confused about, knowing now what you just told us about him, is kind of how he got a platform to begin with. Like, I've seen people on Facebook make accounts and get a following, and just because they've got these crazy ideas and they know he didn't have that, like a guy like the way that you described, I would imagine, especially back then, people would be like, get this dude, tie him in his sack or whatever. I don't know what it was like back then. It's just, I was hoping that maybe there was, he saved somebody from a burning building and became famous, and then he started talking like,
well,
am I making sense? I'm not bashing on the guy. I'm just,
I was exaggerating a little bit his idiosyncrasies just because they're fun to talk about. But he was actually a pretty lively and incredibly engaging lecturer. So his students loved him, and he was friendly and humorous even. He would invite, so even though he never really left Königsberg, he would have these well-attended dinner parties where people would come from all over Europe. And being Kant, he would actually give homework assignments for these people. He would say, all right, if you come to my dinner party, I want you to be prepared to talk about this or this particular subject matter, which wouldn't necessarily always be philosophy. It would be about political matters, social affairs, latest developments in science, and so forth. So he was, although weird, as many philosophers are, he was still a bit of a charmer. And those kind of other idiosyncrasies I talked about have to do with a kind of deep respect for received religion, in particular, the power of Christianity, which we don't have to get into here, but also just quirks of his own personality, you might say. But yeah, so we don't have to focus too much on that, but I hope that helps to
it clears it up when you said that you kind of exaggerated it, because that was just my first gist of it. So I was like, wait a minute, what are we doing? So no, yes, you absolutely did. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So this, like I mentioned here, the so-called Copernican turn. Well, what does that mean? So instead of asking, as philosophers and scientists had done previously, instead of asking, how is it that the structures of my consciousness or the manners of my thought or thinking correspond to phenomena or objects out there in the world, he reverses the order of the question. And the question is now, how is it that phenomena, or what I take to be objects that I can experience in the world, how do they correspond to or conform to the formal categories or the formal structures in an a priori way that constitute human consciousness as such? That is to say, and we can give the example, I can give the examples here of space and time. So according to Kant, and this is all laid out in the Critique of Pure Reason, the first critique, the phenomenon, or what we take to be an appearance, that is to say a phenomenon of space and time, space-time as a whole, it's nothing objective out there in the world, but it's a formal category by which consciousness is able to apprehend existing things in the world that show up as meaningful in a particular sense. And so other such qualities would be cause and effect, substance, quantity, quality more generally. These are not things or properties that are outside of us, that are there, objectively speaking, independent of human experience, but they are the formal a priori elements of human consciousness as such and are therefore intersubjective. That is to say, every human consciousness operates on their basis that render the world intelligible for all humans insofar as we are human. That is, insofar as we have this particular nature, right? Does that make sense? So we'll dig into that, but that concept of form is very important here, because the experience in human life of something like the beautiful is only possible because of the formal structure of human habits of mind. That is, the very habits by which we are attuned to reality as such, that certain things can show up as beautiful and not as good, which is another formal category, not as agreeable, and so forth. Kant articulated this system of what's called transcendental idealism through three critiques, and they aim to lay out the scope, powers, and limits of human consciousness by identifying and clarifying what we'll call the necessary conditions for the possibility of, one, in the first critique, metaphysics. So how is this investigation into the nature of reality possible? Two, ethics. So that's the second critique, which is the critique of practical reason. The first critique is the critique of pure reason. And then third, our work. The third critique, that is the critique of judgment, how aesthetics is possible. So in each instance, Kant distinguishes between form, which are those abstract structures of thought that I was just describing that make experience possible, and then the matter, so the concrete content of that experience, which is constrained or determined by the form. So this is roughly then at every level the correlation between mind and world. And so this is a correlation which Kant takes to be necessary. That is to say, we can't look at the world or objects that are found in the world independently as they might be from human thought. Because anytime we even think of such objects existing, the very manner in which we are thinking them and thus presenting their being to ourselves is through the formal possibilities of the very structure of human cognition, right? So it's impossible to think of the world independently of human thought. We can think of human thought, though, in some measure independently of the world when we're considering the purely formal qualities, right? So we're talking about the formal qualities in terms of what are a priori. A priori meaning something that is knowable, independent of experience. And so looking at ethics, for example, so some of you might be more familiar with Kant in terms of the so-called categorical imperative or his approach to moral philosophy and ethics. Well, if you remember from those discussions, say if you've taken Intro to Ethics before, you'll note that for Kant, to determine whether something is right or wrong doesn't require any experience whatsoever. You can find that any action would be morally right or would be morally wrong just by considering the very nature of that action totally independent of the world or context in which it would show up. That is to say, independently of the consequences of what might happen from it. And so we'll have the occasion to compare the aesthetic, so the nature of the beautiful, to the nature of the good as we dig in a little more deeply to these things. So the philosophical landscape that is now articulated in terms of pre-critical and post-critical. So before Kant's intervention here, before the Copernican turn in the 18th century, it was really forever changed after this. And so the major upshot of this influence, hey, stop, sorry guys, has been this notion, as I just was saying, that we cannot access reality directly, but it's always mediated through concepts or categories that construct reality. So you might have heard of scientific constructivism, which is in some ways comparable to the instrumentalist theory that I was giving an account for before. Okay. So the first critique, and this is still considered Kant's major work, his magnum opus, and it maps out the nature and limits of human cognition. And so that's really what the word critique is doing. So it's when he mentions the critique of judgment as the title of the work that we're dealing with, or the critique of pure reason, and the so-called first critique. Critique doesn't mean criticize, right? He's not saying that judgment is in some way negative or bad, or that pure reason should be criticized. To critique is to map out and call attention to, that is to recognize the limits of some phenomenon. So think of what we were describing or conversing over earlier when it comes to the positive nature of limits as inherited from the Greeks, right? So that's kind of how we should understand critique too. So by giving a critique of reason, we can then see exactly what reason is, what it's capable of, what it's not capable of, and what is other than reason, what is different than reason. And that's what we're trying to do when it comes to judgment. In this case, aesthetic judgment. That is to say, the kind of judgment that we find when it comes to matters of taste. So in other words, judging some object or phenomenon as beautiful or ugly. So when he's making a critique of that, he's trying to delimit, to lay out and advance the categorical distinctions that demarcate such an area of thought, such an area of possible experience from that which it is not, from that which is different. And so that's what he does, just to kind of jump ahead and move through this quickly, when it comes to ethics and the second critique. And then in the third critique, so that's what I have highlighted here, the critique of judgment, it's made up of the first part, which is what we're focusing on. So the excerpts from our textbook are taken from the first half. And that deals with the aesthetic, specifically aesthetic judgments. And then the second half, which we don't have to talk about, it's in many respects importantly distinct as a project. He lays out teleological judgments, but we don't have to concern ourselves with that. So when it comes to a critique of the aesthetic judgment, he's trying to give us an account of the experience of beauty. So insofar as human beings do experience beauty, we have throughout history, we talk about it, we find it important, he wants to make sense of exactly what's going on when that happens. So how to distinguish the experience of the beautiful from the experience of something that we would meaningfully identify as, say, good or pleasant or any other descriptive category that we take to be significantly different than the beautiful, right? So if Aristotle's Poetics is supposed to be, or really is, the most influential work in the history of aesthetics, I think it's beyond a doubt the case that Kant's Critique of Judgment comes in second, right? So this is a hugely influential work. And so it has broad implications, as I mentioned here, not just for our understanding of beauty and art and nature, but for our fundamental self-understanding as human. And what I mean by that is how we are, insofar as we identify as human, rational, sensuous, because we're not purely rational, right? We're also bodily and social beings. And so some philosophers like Hannah Arendt, for example, an important Jewish German philosopher of the 20th century, she actually made the case that Kant's third critique, the critique of judgment, is more relevant or more important for social political questions and considerations, even than it is for aesthetic. And so we'll have an opportunity to talk about that when it comes to this idea of the common sense, right, of sensus communis in Kant, and how that is differentiable from the usual idea of common sense that we have. So I'll ask you guys a question about that as we go on a little bit. Okay, any questions so far? Does this make sense? So this is, we don't need to spend too much time on this. This is just a kind of breakdown of how this work is articulated and constructed and what it is that we're engaging with in terms of it. So you've got the first part, which is the critique of judgment, and that's broken into, so you can see how rigorous, you might say pedantic Kant is in his writing style as a philosopher. That breaks down to the first division, which is the analytic of the aesthetical judgment. And then there's the first book of the first division, which is an analytic of the beautiful. And so that's really what we're working with. So these 4 moments in unpacking or unfolding what it means to be beautiful. So analysis literally is taking some thematic or some phenomenon as a whole or as a totality, and then breaking it down to better clarify what it's composed of, to gain a clearer sense of its constituent parts. And so that's really what he's doing vis-a-vis the beautiful. And then there's the second book of this first division, where he lays out an analytic of another important aesthetic category, the sublime versus the beautiful. And we might have a chance to talk a little bit about the nature of the sublime for Kant. It's really cool. But really today we'll be focused on the nature of the beautiful or beauty. And so here's where I lay out some important vocabulary terms, which will be helpful in making sense of what Kant is up to here and getting some comfort with his style. So we'll just be walking through some passages from the text now. So on pages 280 through 281. So this is the first section. The judgment of taste is aesthetical. So the judgment of taste is aesthetical. And by that, he's making a distinction between the aesthetical as what characterizes this kind of judgment when it comes to taste versus what? So just based on our reading, can anyone think of what the counterpart would be to the aesthetical? So the judgment of taste is aesthetical versus what?
Was it cognitive?
Okay, that's you're moving in the right direction. So cognition, if it's a correct cognition, which produces knowledge, what is one important, let's even say stronger than that, essential, necessary condition of a true cognition, that is a mental event or relation that produces knowledge? It has to be what? I'll give you a hint. It has to be non-contradictory, right? And what's another word for non-contradictory? So what branch of philosophy is specially focused on recognizing and avoiding contradictions? So if you give me what I might experience as a contradictory thought, I would say, this thought makes no sense, right? In other words, it's what?
Illogical? We're talking about logic?
Yeah, perfect. Great. So that's the counterpart here. So the judgment of taste is aesthetical, meaning the judgment of taste, as opposed to a cognitive judgment, is not logical. So a cognitive judgment would be logical. And what's an example of a cognitive judgment? This object is a book. That's a cognitive judgment. And it requires, to make that observation, to say this object that I have in my hand, that I have before my eyes, is a book. That requires not only the sensuous experience of the object, but it also requires the prior conceptual form by which I'm able to say this sensuous material is an example of bookness, right? And so when I make that judgment, it's logical because the manifold, the sensuous manifold of the appearance of this physical thing that I have before me, it satisfies the logical criteria of what it takes for anything to be a particular instance of a book, right? So I need, first of all, experience, which is sensory, but I also need logic, that is concepts. I need the concept of a book to say that this book, this object I have is a book. I mean, that's what we do too, to use this example. When I'm washing dishes, right, and I want to put them away in the appropriate place in the cabinet, I will say, oh, well, this strangely or peculiarly flat-ish kind of circular disc thing that I'm holding and I pull from the dishwasher, well, that's a plate, right? So that's a cognitive judgment. I take a sensuous appearance and I categorize it or subsume it under some logical form. And that allows me to put it in this cabinet with the other plates and not this cabinet, right? Or not in the oven or something like that. So that's the role of cognitive judgments, which operate by the logic, or excuse me, the lights of logic. Okay. So now he's going to unpack that. So on page 280 to 281, in order to distinguish whether anything is beautiful or not, we refer the representation not by the understanding to the object for cognition, but by the imagination to the subject and its feeling of pleasure or pain. So what I have highlighted in blue here corresponds to these definitions to help us make sense of that. What is a representation? So in order to distinguish whether something is beautiful, we refer the representation. So what is the representation? Well, from the German, it's Vorstellung, and literally it's that which is put or posited for or before a mind or consciousness. So when I perceive or conceive of any object, I'm representing it in consciousness as seen, heard, smelt, felt, tasted, remembered, imagined, regretted, etc. So I see visually the wine glass on the table and I represent it visually. So I'm experiencing a visual representation. In short, what is the representation? Well, it's the experienced object. Insofar, however, it's determined or conditioned in the experience by a subject, right? So does that make sense? What a representation is? So if I want to decide whether this painting is beautiful or not, in the pursuit of reaching some aesthetical judgment of it, the painting itself, in my visual experience of it, is the representation. So then I would refer the painting, strictly speaking, the representation I have of it, not by the understanding to the object for cognition. So what is understanding? Well, he lays this out as an important category in the first critique, which is the category that produces representations. So another one of these categories, and one that's more significant for Kant's project in the third critique, which is what we're reading. So the critique of judgment is imagination. But the understanding, which is a capacity of human consciousness, which intersubjectively every human consciousness shares, is that which gives rise to the logical perspective that we were talking about before, such that I can say, this object I pull from the dishwasher belongs in this cabinet with the other plates and not in my drawer with my socks, right? So it's really because of the understanding. I understand, that is to say, I have a concept of plates, dishes, cutlery. I have a concept of socks. And I have formally then, on the basis of these differential concepts, given myself the capacity to make sense of my experience of this or that object, to render it intelligible, to say this is a plate and not a pair of socks. And on that basis, on the recognition, on the basis of that recognition, I do things differently. So I put the plate in a cabinet and not in my sock drawer. Right? So it gives rise then to the logical perspective, which enables us to compare concepts with each other. So I can compare the concept of plate to the concept of sock or of bird or whatever else. And then it also gives rise to the empirical perspective, which is also called judgment, which enables us to combine concepts with sensory information. And on the basis of that synthesis, we get knowledge, specifically empirical knowledge. So because I have the concept of cutlery, dishware, plates, and I'm experiencing these material objects in my kitchen, I'm able to synthesize the concepts, the sensuous content of my experience to arrive at a particular conclusion, which is a judgment. So I say, I should put this plate in this cabinet and not in my sock drawer. So not by understanding the object for cognition, but by the imagination to the subject and its feeling of pleasure or pain. So object here in the German Objekt is a general term for anything that is conditioned by the subject's representation and so is capable of being known. So to really fully unpack the sentence then, if I want to distinguish whether the sunset or the flowers surrounding me in my yard here, or a particular painting or piece of music, if I want to arrive at a determinate judgment with respect to that phenomeno's beauty or ugliness, I don't, like I have been suggesting when it comes to the plate, I don't refer the sensuous object before me to a concept to result in some particular cognitive judgment. But instead, that is to say, instead of referring the representation through the medium of the understanding to the object out of there in the world, I'm actually referring the representation by my faculty of imagination to not the object outside of me, but to myself as a subject, precisely because when I am looking at the painting or looking at the flowers or the sunset or whatever else, that perception or experience is accompanied by a feeling of pleasure or pain. And that is exactly where the phenomenon of beauty as a kind of judgment arises in the first place. So here's a photograph I took of a sunset some time ago from behind my house. So you can see behind me on the other side of the trees over there is a cemetery. So I was standing in the cemetery looking kind of westward, and there's a sunset there. But just to continue with these vocabulary terms. So cognition is a legitimate moment of knowledge where a sensory input is brought together with a concept. And so this is the example I was using before. I see this flat disc-like object in the kitchen and I immediately categorize it. I put it under the concept plate and then I act in accordance with that understanding. But what is imagination versus cognition? Imagination is the faculty responsible for forming concepts out of what is given through our senses, and then also for joining together such sensory, what Kant calls intuitions, with concepts to form objects that can be interpreted and judged. So on the basis of what I've experienced through my sensory engagement with the world, the imagination is this faculty which bridges the gap between sensuous experiences in an immediate way. So this is kind of a mediating term, and concepts that would render those intelligible and ordered. So because I have experienced sensory phenomena in different events of my life, I can build on that and create spontaneously a variety of forms and so forth in my imagination, which aren't determinately constrained by the specific quality or nature of my past experience. So that's what he means by imagination, and that's why it's more important than cognition or the understanding when it comes to aesthetics and the experience of beauty. And then what is subject? Well, as opposed to object, for Kant, that's a general term for any rational person who's capable of having knowledge. So then when I refer the experience of beauty through the imagination to the subject, I'm referring it to myself, precisely when it comes to the quality of pleasure or pain. So here's what that sentence means then, in yellow. When I judge this sunset, when I look at this sunset and I call it beautiful, I am representing it as beautiful, right? So that is to say, when we use these adjectives, we are characterizing and defining or delimiting the very nature of our experience as represented in this or that way. And so in this case, what is the representation? It doesn't come from my understanding, because the understanding, as we've seen when it comes to plates, for example, categorizing different things, and we can even do that with a sunset, for example, if I categorize it as a kind of meteorological phenomenon, right? That is to say, I am coming to some point of knowledge about it. If I want to explain to you why a certain sunset is made up of these, or I should say of this array of colors and not this array of colors. So I can use cognition when it comes to explaining causally what sunsets are scientifically, how they are produced, and so forth. But that has nothing to do with my judgment of it being beautiful. So it doesn't then come from the understanding, which supplies these definite concepts. The point of my judgment, so when I say this sunset is beautiful, the point of that judgment is not to generate knowledge, or in other words, cognition. So for example, when I say, oh, this is a plate in my hand, I know what I'm dealing with, and I thus can communicate that knowledge to others. If I have house guests, for example, I could say, yeah, put the plates in the second cabinet in the kitchen, right? That would be to transmit some kind of knowledge to the person, knowledge specifically of where I happen to keep my dishes in my house. But when I judge that the sunset is beautiful, I'm giving expression to a particular feeling of pleasure, which attends my subjective experience. And thus we're now at a place to recognize this ultimately subjective nature of the experience of beauty. Okay, so far so good. Is this making some sense? I know this is really complicated. But now we're still continuing. We're almost out of time, but we'll pick this up where we left off last time. But I'll give a chance, or we'll get started next time, I should say, with the presenters, and then we'll work from there. But this is what he says still in section 1. The judgment of taste is therefore not a judgment of cognition, and is consequently not logical, but aesthetical. So this is why he says it's aesthetical, by which we understand that whose determining ground, so the German there is bestimmen Grund, can be no other than subjective. So determining, bestimmen, you could also translate that as conditioning. So the conditioning ground here is subjective because I am experiencing pleasure, or if it's a shitty, ugly painting that I don't like, I'm experiencing some kind of pain when I look at it, right? And so here are the ways that I lay out to define or make sense of these terms that are relevant here. So taste, on page 286, we get a definition of taste. Taste is the faculty of judging of an object or a method of representing it by an entirely disinterested satisfaction or dissatisfaction. So we'll have to make sense of what he means by disinterested. So paradoxically sounding, disinterested interest, and this is related to another paradox or something that seems to be paradoxical in Kant. Purposiveness without purpose. Those are the phrases or the essential language by which we should understand, in accordance with Kant's theoretical approach here, what the nature of beauty entails. So when you experience beauty, truly experience beauty, not simply something that you think is good in a logical sense, or something that you find in a sensuous sense, gratifying or pleasurable, such as you favoring pizza over spaghetti or something like that. But when you experience something truly beautiful, in the strong sense that we usually mean it, that can be differentiated from these other modes of human experience, you find it purposive because it seems designed. It could be a painting which actually was designed, or maybe a beautiful sunset, which is so striking that it seems as if, just in terms of its form, that it had to be deliberate, right? Yet, there is no purpose to it. It's just sort of there. So that's what he means by purposiveness without purpose. And we'll gain some clarity on what he means by uninterested or disinterested interest. But just to unpack it, and we're out of time here, but finding something beautiful is a result not of a cognitive judgment, that is one that produces knowledge, but of an aesthetical judgment. So it's an expression of my feeling of pleasure. Okay, so I'll stop sharing it there, but are there any final questions or comments before we go? So hopefully this stuff is making some sense, but what do you guys think? You're all right with this, or is it just way over your head at this point? What do you guys think?
It makes sense, but it's really nice that you're holding our hand for most of it. It was pretty dense.
Yeah. Okay, so it is really dense and difficult, but I hope it makes some sense at this point, and we'll continue working through this on Thursday. So we'll have some breakout rooms, some discussion, and we'll have our presenters, and then we'll continue through these questions and concepts. And again, just looking ahead a couple of weeks, when our midterm paper is due, there's no new material, so we're a little behind, but we'll be able to catch up and put some clarity where it's needed at that point. Okay. All right, guys. So thanks for bearing with me. And I hope you guys have a nice day. And I'll see you guys on Thursday. And for those set up to present, let me know if you have any questions as we're getting closer to that day.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.